right, everybody, come on in. I have a treat for you today. It's different than the conversations I usually have because Philip K. Howard, who is a lawyer, an author, and also an advocate of radical change in the way we govern ourselves. His many books, from Death of Common Sense to his current Can Do, Saving Can Do, are attempts to reimagine how accountability works. And if I understand it correctly, an attempt to create more space to get things done in America. And his views don't fit squarely into the political struggle of the moment, which is why this is a little unusual for us, but that happens when you talk to people who think for themselves. They don't fit in a normal box. But for democracy advocates like me, the functioning of government and the rule of law are essential pillars to this enterprise, this political enterprise we usually talk about. And that's precisely what his work focuses on and why I think this will be an interesting conversation. Philip, thank you for joining me.
Nice to be with you.
I hope I got it right about the area of focus of your work. Can you describe the idea that animates all of it, and in particular, your latest book?
Yes, I basically have one idea, which I've parlayed into 8 books now, which is...
And a TED Talk.
Yeah, and a TED Talk and lots of other things. Yeah. Which is that nothing happens unless a human makes it happen. And so what I argue is that many of the problems of modern society, not only the paralysis of government, but also the populist resentment, stems in large part from a flaw in the operating structures of government, not the policies of government that people argue about, but the operating structures, which were changed after the 1960s with the best of intentions, to become a sort of legal compliance system with 1,000-page rule books and procedures and all that sort of stuff. And I argue that that system is just a version of central planning and should be replaced by a system more like the one that the framers envisioned, which is where law creates a framework for authority, but then officials and others have room to roll up their sleeves and make judgments to make things happen.
So my own lived experience leads me to think that's right about half the time, and the other half of the time terrifies me. So let me give you some examples. So I was a Chicago alderman. I was a public school teacher, and I dealt with some of these issues. And then I was a Chicago alderman, and I watched a lot of my colleagues go to jail. But they went to jail in part because the structure of government in Chicago gave them authority to make a bunch of decisions. There wasn't the regulatory framework about who gets a driveway permit or who gets a zoning variance. It was in the hands of individuals who made those decisions, and they made them for a pocket full of cash often. So, I mean, I worry a little bit. And of course, they either went to jail or got voted out. So in the end, the system purges itself, but the problem persists, forever.
Yeah, so you can use there are lots of different examples, and I find it's useful to talk about the organization of schools versus, for example, infrastructure permits versus other things,
right?
As separate problems, and the frameworks need to be separate. And I'm not arguing for no rules,
right? Of course not.
I'm arguing for a framework, a legal framework, in which people, though, have room to make trade-off judgments. So in the case of, say, a driveway permit or a building department permit, in general, there should be less room for discretion. There are a set of guidelines for whether you can, have a driveway off of an arterial road or whatever.
Right.
And if there needs to be an exception, then there should be a process that highlights the exception and the reasons for the exception, and which doesn't mean there's no room for corruption. There's still room for corruption. But all the studies on corruption conclude, or the ones I've read, which is many, conclude the best protection is to actually locate individual responsibility in particular people, so that you know whose bank account to check.
That's interesting. And it's surprising, because I was sure you were going to say the best way to make sure there is less corruption is to have fewer regulatory decisions, because each of those creates a possibility for corruption.
No, and so, for example, in the Parking Violations Bureau scandal in New York City a few decades ago, it was an elaborate process with so many bureaucratic checks that you could never find a decision maker. But it turned out that the people who were doing the corruption knew how to game the system and to write the procurement guidelines in such a way and to steer it in such a way that it went to the people who paid them.
Yeah. So that's interesting. That's sort of one side. The other side is the former mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, who I worked with a lot and I liked a lot, got fed up because it took like 11 years to get a runway at O'Hare when everybody knew he needed it. And he said the Chinese get that runway in about 3 weeks. Right. And he finally got so fed up with something at another airport in Chicago, he just brought the plows in and dug up the runway overnight one night because he wasn't going to wait any longer for permits.
Right. And so we have this system where we're trying to avoid the Robert Moseses of the world, right?
Yes.
Who kind of, bulldoze entire neighborhoods in the South Bronx without any transparency or oversight, right?
And may have saved Manhattan in the process. It's complicated.
Yeah. Well, Robert Moses, I'd say 90% of what he did was fantastic. But 10% was awful, and another 10% he wanted to do would have been disastrous, to completely wipe out Lower Manhattan.
Yep.
But by the way, my background is as a civic leader. So I was chair of the Municipal Arts Society for over a decade, Save Grand Central, all that kind of stuff. So before I started writing books, I was battling real estate developers against sort of horrible projects. And that's how
one of them now the president of the United States.
Right. Well, I know Donald Trump, right? Yeah. Very well. I used to have to argue with him all the time. So, by the way, he's not changed. He's always been this way. He's never been reliable. He's never been trustworthy. He's just says whatever it takes to get what he wants. But the effort to try to avoid Robert Moses then leads to these really rigid compliance-based systems where the failure to overturn one pebble can get a project reversed. And so you end up having these decade-long processes that double or triple the cost of project, the effective cost of projects, or block them altogether. Mm-hmm. And so as a result of going from Robert Moses to this kind of process paralysis, we get the overreaction in the other direction, where we get Donald Trump, who's now sort of, bulldozing the East Wing because he can, right? So what I argue in Saving Can Do, in my other books, is that there's actually an intellectual framework for giving people responsibility that doesn't let them do whatever they want to do, including, if we don't trust people, nobody trusts anybody anymore, providing checks and balances after the fact. I mean, one of the things, I've been working with some procurement experts on this. Let's pick a number. It's 1,000 times more efficient to have a third party review and approve a decision after the fact than it is to go through years of process before the fact.
Yes. I also, part of my life, worked in the Clinton administration, was part of Reinventing Government, by the way, and thank you for your preface to Al Gore's book. Right. And that was a process that was enormously difficult because the federal government is the last place to reinvent. But we were able to make some progress and get some things done. My sense is that much of the progress came from talking to the people who worked there, who were living the complications that the things that you talk about create. And he said, look, I know we can get more done.
Right, completely. So the whole Doge effort, which in theory sounded great, government efficiency and all that, but in fact was not about efficiency. It was just a particularly crude form of deregulation. It was like like the sack of Rome, but it was the
deregulation and fire.
Yeah, it was like this, it's like the sack of bureaucracy or something. I mean, having a functioning civil service system is actually really important. And Trump is correct, I think, that the civil service system is broken. And so he has asserted presidential authority over public servants. I think that was generally a good thing. But the way he's doing it doesn't recognize that civil servants have a dual obligation, which is not only to be managed by the elected executive, but also to obey the law. And in the case of experts, to be true to their expertise, not to change their conclusions because somebody upstairs thinks that the labor statistics are unfavorable or something.
Right. So or the hurricane's going in a different direction.
Yeah. So you have this kind of madness of decades of kind of unmanageable government and paralytic process, and most of which came out of after the 1960s for reasons we could go into. And now you've got the needle pushed to the other extreme. And what I worry about is that still nobody's talking about what's important, which is, okay, how do you make it work? How do we make government responsive to the people? How do we create a merit system in civil service that honors people who do a good job and that sort of thing? And so what we do at this little not-for-profit that I started is we work with leading experts and think tanks to try to actually make proposals about how to fix things.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things we've learned in the last 20 years is the enormous importance of state governments. The power they have is enormous in our lives, and they are easier to fix in some ways than federal government. And I would imagine you're having some success in some states.
That's right. I was talking to the governor of Kentucky the other day about this. I mean, the closer you are to the ground, the more receptivity there is to practical choices.
Yes, you're much nicer than I am. I would have said the less patience there is for wasting people's time and money.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Your constituents want to know when you're going to fix the problem.
Right. Whereas Washington is like one big abstraction. And in this
exactly
case,
the word I had in my head.
Yeah, it's one big abstraction. And Washington and all those people in Washington who drive their fancy cars and everything are make money by doing nothing. They just talk. They're just, they have their place on the tug of war, and they tug the other way, and they tug, and nothing. And so the forces of inertia are almost impossible to surmount. That's why, in general, change always happens from the outside. It never happens from the inside. So that's why I think we need a new movement and a new vision, how to govern and such. And again, my concern is that I don't see either party even having any interest in having a new vision for making things work.
Yeah.
The Democrats are waiting for Trump to fail, which is
happening in real time.
Yeah, it's happening in real time. But they don't have a alternative vision either. And I think Mandami has.
He has a vision.
Things going for him, but he doesn't have a vision about how to make government work either.
I think that I'm not worried about that in the same way you are. I think how we make government do the job for people will be an issue in the next election cycle, and then it will become part of the primary fight. And you will then there's no forum for that vision at this second. In the political process, we'll deliver it in a year and a half because the winner of the primary at least on the Democratic side is going to have to answer this question. Okay, Donald Trump broke the government. Now what are we going to do with it? We're going to, because nobody thinks we should rebuild it exactly the way it was before he broke it.
Well, do you know anyone who is presenting a new vision for how the government could work better?
I know I've talked to governors, and they are struggling with this idea, and they're thinking about it all the time. And I spend a lot of time talking to mayors, and mayors really think about this all the time. And I think one of the things the politics of this last couple of years have done is they've said this, at least on the Democratic side, this movement is local and dispersed and happening all over the country. It's not happening in Washington. And so there's a chance that out of that, the ideas where the rubber meets the road are going to be ones that get talked about and pursued.
Right. My concern is that the legal structure that's been built up over the last 50 years, and that's can be counted. It's 150 million words of binding federal law and regulations. That the legal structure is written to be mandatory and rigid. So when some local official wants to organize the schools, there are all these rules that say, well, you've got to keep the paperwork to do that and to show this, and you've got to be able to do this other. And so
it's stifling, right?
Yeah. Well, it's so you almost have to disavow the law or ignore it in order to actually make needed choices.
Yeah, some of that is, I'm not an attorney, but I know this story, and you've heard it too, the town with one attorney and the attorney's broke, and then there are two attorneys in the same town and they both get rich, right? I think a lot of the language in our law code is put there by folks who are, who are the lobbyists and the lawyers who figured out how to fight for their clients, and all of that is appropriate, but it's led us to a morass.
Yeah, and the people who write laws in Congress, I spent a lot of time with Congress and others on trying to do infrastructure permitting reforms, and the statutes they write are, even the reform statutes are incoherent, and they come up with ideas like the one they came up with about a decade ago for a 16-member permitting council. And they summoned me to the White House to tell me how they had organized all this, and they had dashboards to show where all the approvals were and all that kind of stuff. And it went on and on, and explaining how it worked. At the end of it, I just have one question, which is, just in case one member of this 16-member permitting council doesn't agree, who has authority to make a decision? And the answer was immediate. No one has.
No, everybody has veto power.
Yeah, everybody has veto power, right? And so the whole idea of consensus in any group is basically corrupt, because what it does is it gives whoever wants to game the system the power to game the system.
Right? Totally agree with that. I think states and cities are better and provide some models for how you get things done.
Without any question. And I just want the feds to get out of the way. So
a lot, right? A lot. But they collect a lot of money, and they're not going to give it away without some strings. And there are reasons, so let's go back to the 60s, where you have located the source of the trouble. Two things, really, right? One was a sense of individual rights that had to be protected, and so we went down this path of at least a lot of advocacy around individual rights as opposed to societal ones, and also this new battle between citizens and corporations over something called the environment, which proved to be complicated because property rights are a real thing in America, and the environment was a new thing.
Yeah, and so I think the change in values after the 60s for safe cars, for environmental protection, to end systemic discrimination, all those things were necessary and overdue. My concern is that it's just that how they're done. I mean, the worker safety laws, for example, are a good idea that came in after the 60s, but they're done with a kind of rote compliance model with 4,000 rules. Stairwells shall be lit by natural or artificial light. Well, that's helpful.
What's the other example? Light a fire?
I mean, yeah, exactly. So you have these kind of efforts at what one expert called rationalized completeness, where there's a rule for everything, and it just doesn't acknowledge
judgment.
Well, trade-offs, and also the fact that the human brain is not a computer. So working memory. I've worked with there's an area of psychology called cognitive overload. Mm-hmm. And the leading expert is a guy named John Sweller, who's a psychologist in Australia. And so I've worked with him on this. And basically, if you give people too many requirements that they can't internalize, like you internalize training as a doctor or lawyer or whatever. Sure. But if you have to think through a checklist all the time, your actually conscious memory freezes. It can only hold a few things at once. Whereas the brilliant part of the human brain is in our subconscious. It's a quote, long-term memory. So you give people in a factory too many rules that they're checking off, then they no longer actually can access the smart part of their brain. That's right. So figuratively speaking, people trip over the buzzsaw where their noses are in the rule book. And so that's and there's studies that show that. And there's studies in Illinois, where you live, there's studies of nursing home regulation that show that the regulation probably makes the nursing homes worse.
Not safe. Yeah.
And because there's just too many rules, and they're too marginal, and they're not focusing on what's important, which is a clean and caring nursing home.
So because you raised that example, I mean, it's one I know something about. The genesis of this mess is something terrible happens in a nursing home, whatever it is. And society reacts and says, we can't let that happen again.
Yeah,
that was a terrible thing. So what are the tools that society has to use, right? Because shaming the owner isn't one anymore that works. So you end up going and saying, well, we have to have a set of rules that will stop that.
Right.
And great, it stops that, but it stops other things too.
Well, it's worse than that. It suffocates the human spirit for good nursing homes. I mean, Australia changed their nursing home regulation a few decades ago. Got rid of their 1,000-page rule book and replaced it with 31 general principles. Have a home-like setting, respect the dignity of the residents, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Within a year, they were twice as good. And it turned out that the vagueness of the regulation actually led people to toward the middle of the lane, against the and it created a kind of a dynamic where people who thought something was wrong, the relatives of the person in the nursing home or the regulator, could raise issues, but it was always a subject of discussion. And if somebody really abused their authority, the regulator still had authority to shut it down.
So what's coming to mind in this example is this question of human freedom in a way, because what we see in the autocratic world, and frankly, some out of this administration, is setting a system where there's self-censorship, right, where people are afraid to act in certain ways. And what you're talking about is a system that is the opposite of that encourages the opposite of self-censorship, but creatively solving problems.
Right, that's right. But with a hierarchy of authority,
yeah,
where people can make choices. So if there's an abuse in a nursing home, depending on the level of abuse, you can shut it down.
Yeah,
and and financial companies in this in America,
Mhm.
generally have, it's not perfect. We're talking about human affairs now, right? So
Right.
nothing's
Where
perfect.
nothing's perfect.
Right, nothing's perfect. But we're generally, they know that somebody has the authority to get to them if they don't keep the books correctly, or they,
Right. Yep.
countenance fraud, or whatever it happens to be. So accountability is an incredibly important aspect of society in ways that people don't fully understand. So in the public sector, for example, where, let's take the state of Illinois again, or the city of Chicago, where there's basically no accountability of public employees, unless they commit a crime or something. When everybody knows there's no accountability, then there's no mutual trust that people are actually working hard and upholding standards and doing their jobs. So it's very hard to actually manage a good agency or good school, because you have to overcome the kind of presumption against trust, because people know that there's no accountability.
Yeah, I mean, I want to think about that differently. There's accountability to your peers, and often that means accountability to protect things that shouldn't be protected. So, right, you're on the garbage truck
Right.
with everybody else, and
Right.
nobody's looking, so you borrow a hose from a neighbor saying it's a hot day, our guys need water, and instead you fill the truck with water so that it seems heavier, so you can come back at the end of the day and say, look, we did everything in 4 hours that should have taken us 8, because look how heavy we are. And everybody in the truck keeps that quiet, because we created a system where that is the accountability and not to the
right. And so cops, there's a problem with cops with that. So zero accountability.
Same thing.
Right. So when that gets caught, those people in my world should lose their jobs, or worse. Yes, I agree with that. There are all kinds of games people play, and if people go along with it, then they're complicit, and they should be liable in an accountable system too. But if the sanitation commissioner or whoever is in charge of the has to go through a legal trial
for everybody
to terminate somebody, then they're never going to do it. And the way that the collective bargaining agreements work in Illinois and in many big states is that the requirement of proof is higher, and the people judging the case are arbitrators who are picked by the unions.
It's tough to do, for sure.
Yeah, so the fix is in. I mean, just not to put a fine point on this, but I'm working with the Liberty Justice Center in Chicago to organize a constitutional challenge to public union controls in the state of Illinois.
Okay, we're going to leave that for a different conversation. But
okay,
yep. Okay. All right. At one point in my life, I ran the Chicago Housing Authority. I ran it when the federal government took it over. So we had a few degrees of freedom that the folks didn't have who ran it before me. And we cleaned it up. But that required doing exactly the things that you're talking about, being really clear about what the job is that had to be done, being really clear about the accountabilities of people to get it done, and having some important conversations with our union partners to make sure they understood what the role was, and we got it off of many, many years of a list of,
And how were you able to persuade the unions to actually do the job instead of fight for whatever their entitlements are?
Well, we had a unique possibility. I mean, it's a story you'll like, but it's not repeatable. It turns out after the Clean Air Act was passed in 1972, none of these buildings could have incinerators anymore. So the staff that the janitors who were moving the things to the incinerators. Anyway, the long and short of it is everybody bumped a job down in their job category. So by the time we got there, everybody was getting paid for this job, but they were doing this job. So we got to say to them, when all your contracts are up, okay, fine. You got whatever you want, do your job. And none of them, of course, were trained to do those jobs because for 20, 30 years, they'd been doing a different job and getting away with it. So we were able to say, you know what, fine, we will train people for the real jobs they should have. We'll do all of this with you, but here's what has to happen. And they were great. They knew what
and they did it. And they did it. Okay, great. I mean, I think that, it's interesting. So much of life is in politics too, is the frame of reference, right? That you bring to something. And so if you can change a frame of reference in an institution where now everybody says, oh no, okay, we've got to rethink how we're doing and we're all in on it and we've got to do a good job. All of a sudden you can have a good culture. Sometimes it sounds like you almost created a new organization. I mean, in the case of New Orleans after the Hurricane Katrina, they closed down all the public schools and they created an all charter school system, right? So it was a whole new system. It's the same students, many of the same people, but it was with a new organization with new expectations, and it worked better. But
it has its controversies, and it got into trouble later. The guy who did it, of course, came from here, Paul Vallis.
Paul Vallis.
But you're also, I guess, the framework that you're talking about makes space for leadership, and leadership is entirely consonant with freedom. It's not opposed to it, like a lot of young people think. It makes space for it, and because you have to have organizations that have a shared mission.
Right. Let's just talk about this for a second. Mm-hmm. So it's not something you mentioned, the idea of individual rights. So I think that the rights that the framers created in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the due process, all this stuff, those are all rights against state coercion. The government can't tell you what to say. They can't take your property away, throw you in jail without due process of law, all that. Those were the rights of a free society. So visually, if you think of a free society, law sets boundaries of what people can't do. Government can't come in and take your property away. It's a boundary. It's a legal boundary. Mm-hmm. No one's allowed to steal or pollute or cheat on their contract. Those are boundaries, right? And within those boundaries, it's like a corral, is a field of freedom where people interact honestly. They can be obnoxious.
Yes.
They can be rude. They can do a lousy job. They can do all sorts of things, but other people are free to hold them accountable.
Yes.
And so it's like a giant marketplace of people judging people in a free society. And America, the American form of freedom, which that was the formal structure of, was just astonishingly productive. One of the things it resulted in, unlike other countries, it resulted in this pluralistic society where the Swedes all live in Minnesota and the Mormons go to Utah and the Hasidic Jews are in Brooklyn and the communist intellectuals are on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and the whatever, and the techies are in the Silicon Valley, right? So we have this thing wonderfully, but also allowed people to invent themselves and own themselves. That was a great, wonderfully sort of cathartic idea of how to run a society. The rights that came out of the 1960s were rights against people with authority. The supervisor can't sue you or can't fire you unless he can prove that you didn't do the job correctly. And now that's sort of gone down to where college professors don't feel they have the right to give you a B or a C because they feel they might have to prove that your thinking is lousy or you're not doing. And so the problem with this idea, with this idea of rights, first analytically, it's rights against the freedom of other people. It's not rights against government. It's rights against the supervisor. The supervisor is a free person. And if he complies with law, he ought to, in my view, have the responsibility to do the supervisor's job. And what's counterproductive about this idea of rights is that we didn't understand that our freedom within an institution, our freedom in a school, let's say, hinges on the authority of the principal, which has to be well executed, to uphold values and standards, because then you get mutual trust. Everybody's working at it, and you go to any good school, and there's mutual trust. Everybody's rolling up their sleeves. We have a daughter who's a teacher. Being a teacher is really hard.
It's really hard.
And to teach well requires a lot of emotional commitment all the time. I mean, it is not. We're not talking about an easy job. We're not talking about working. And so to put the energy into to being a good teacher, you need to know that the people in the school not only honor that, but they feel the same way.
Mm-hmm. And that, and that happens. I mean, I think of the arc of school reform in the last, since Terrell Bell wrote A Nation at Risk in the Reagan years, we've had a school reform movement in America. And I actually think, I know in Chicago, public schools are better than when I taught in them, in part because of a long effort to train and empower principals, to create school leadership, school level leadership that worked. And I mean, God knows there's a long way to go, but it's a lot better than when I was teaching there in the 1980s. And part because they took seriously the questions that you're talking about.
Right. And so I just want to, just circling back to rights, the quote, rights of the teacher in the case of many jurisdictions, never to be fired. There was an 18-year study in Illinois about an average of 2 teachers per year out of 95,000 were dismissed for performance. I mean, we're talking about a big problem. Near zero accountability. Right. So that's why this modern idea of rights is so incoherent. Whose rights? Teachers' rights or the 25 kids in the classroom? So whose rights should be? So someone has to make a judgment there. And by the way, I don't think you have to trust that person. Nobody trusts anybody. I don't trust anyone because my brothers used to get me up on the seesaw and get off, So they taught me how to distrust people, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have to. I used to have this argument with the head of the teachers union. She said, "Oh, we need quote due process because of the teachers will be abused by the principal who'll demand sexual favors or whatever." I said, well, that's terrible. I agree with that. Ought to be protected against. So why don't we have a parent-teacher committee that has authority to veto a termination decision by the principal? Everybody knows who the bad teachers are and who the good teachers are in a school, generally.
Well, okay, so that's interesting because the counterexample to this covers the counterexample, which is modern day Florida, where teachers got fired because they wouldn't hide the books in their classroom when they were told these books are all banned. You have to cover all the books, and they got fired for not doing that. So they did get fired. The system that you have in place would have protected them from being fired. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So you can protect. So, for example, large manufacturers like Toyota, they have workers' councils.
Yes,
and they'll have a worker before they fire somebody. They'll actually talk with the coworkers.
Yes, of course.
Make sure it's not being done fair, because any decent employer has an interest in all the workers trusting their decisions.
That's
for the
right.
reasons I've already stated. So there's not like, I mean, yes, you've got all kinds of people who will do things for the wrong motives and stuff, and let's protect against them. But having a legal hearing just simply entrenches the worst people without protecting the good people.
So you and I are running low on time. We actually run. I thought we would go a half hour. We're going to go almost 45 minutes, which is lovely because it's really interesting. And I'm grateful for your time. But I would say this is the 5-minute warning.
Okay, great.
I want to just one other thing. Like I am not sure. I want to think about the rights question because it's very complicated. But what I've noticed about, if you will, the left in America is that since the 1960s, we have outsourced progress to lawyers on the theory that they could go to court and make an argument for our rights. And we have found, I think, to a great and shocking awakening lately, that doesn't work. That in fact, those courts can say something quite different, and it doesn't work. Or they could be ignored. So what the left has had to learn, and I think has learned it with rapidity, is that there's an old muscle that is very American, but they haven't exercised in a long time, and that is mass political strength, creating large coalitions to get things done. And when you do that, it is about getting things done. Right. About actually making a difference in our lives. And this is where the politics of the moment, this arc of, if you outsource everything to a legal system to where all your progress is going to be lawyers fighting for rights, it turns out it doesn't work. And it runs aground, which is what has happened recently and driven us into the present crisis.
Right. But to get a mass movement, I agree with everything you just said. Yeah. But to get a mass movement, you have to have a coherent principle of change. We're going to abandon laissez-faire and start having government oversight so we don't abuse child labor in the workforce. My concern with where we are now, and I love what the abundance guys are doing, and I go and get pieces for them and everything, is that they don't have a coherent principle about where to go. And the coherent principle is that we're at a point in the arc of governing where there are two big problems. We have the traditional problem of just legacy bureaucracies, the sediment in the harbor grows, and it's time for a spring cleaning. But we have a bigger problem, which is that we reorganized government after the 60s on the explicit goal of avoiding human judgment and replacing it with what we thought would be simply rote compliance with law. Objective proof, follow the rules. Who can blame me? And we need to rebuild that so that simplify it and replace it with something so that we can build infrastructure, run a school, do all the stuff that makes government work. And it's not about policy. It's about operating structures.
So I hear you. And the reason I'm less worried about it is that the imperative, given where it's coming from, is going to be to get stuff done. Right? And you cannot get stuff done without fixing some of the problems that you're talking about, whether the people know how they're fixing it, whether they understand, have a framework for it or not. As like Rich Daley just said, I'm going to plow up they're going to get stuff done again.
Right. Josh Shapiro fixing I-95, just make the decisions, right?
Just get it done. Yeah. So I think the decision framework will follow the reality, as it often does in government.
Well, I hope you're right.
Yeah, but I've enjoyed this conversation immensely. You're as I said at the beginning, you're willing to think your own thoughts, which is in this particular era we live in is a rare and wonderful thing.
Well, thank you, and I think it's important. I think it's important to leave our children with a government that can deliver and a society that isn't riven
at each other's throats.
Yeah, because everyone's so frustrated they reach for extremist solutions when most people just want to get things done.
And I think that exact insight that most people want to get things done is going to leave the folks who are just playing the edges aside.
Well, hopefully.
All right. Your most recent book is Saving Can Do. You can get it at Amazon and anywhere else you get a book. And you can find Philip Howard all over the internet. You can see his stuff. It's interesting. You should take a look.
Right.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. Thanks to everybody.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.